Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, the only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, SignalR, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Caprogman-Taylor, and this is episode 35, Entity Framework with Jon Smith. In this episode, I interviewed Jon about what Entity Framework Core is, and how you can use it to speed up the development of your applications. Some of you may know Jon from his many open source libraries, including netcore.autoregister.di, his talks at NDC, and his book Entity Framework Core in Action. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. So the first thing I'd like to say, Jon, is thank you ever so much for being on the show. We're all really busy people, and taking the time out to talk to me about, the topic we're going to cover today is, I'm very, very appreciative of it. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, you're very welcome. To start with, I was wondering, could you maybe introduce yourself, give the listeners a bit of a clue as to who you are and the kind of work you do and all that kind of stuff?
Okay, so my name's Jon Smith. I am a contract programmer, and I've already had an interesting career. I started out as a programmer, went into managing technical people, programmers, and my last full-time paid job was I was technical director of a small to medium enterprise. But then I got called back to programming by my wife, who is a lecturer in maths at Southampton University in the UK. And she is a specialist on healthcare modelling. And she's got all the maths, but then the NHS in the UK said, could you model this? And so I came back to programming via that route. And I have done a number of jobs with her now, but mainly now I do web applications, particularly on the back end.
Oh, I see. Excellent. I do like to meet other web application folks, especially the server-side stuff. I'm kind of falling into this camp of the full-stack developer is starting to disappear, and that's not a case of fewer people doing full stack, and it's my opinion that I think it's shared by a lot of people that the full stack is becoming a term that encompasses so many things. You've got, just for front end, you've got Angular and Vue and React and Blazor and all of these technologies, and just knowing one of them enough to be productive enough to build a wonderful front end is so difficult to do. So like I say, I like to meet other web devs and discuss where they're coming from and where they're at and which side of the silicon they like to live on. As important as the server side is, the client side is as important. The server side is preparing all the CRUD and the data. The client side is doing a lot of the user interaction and showing it. And that's not to reduce what people do. It's just, it's a completely different skill set. It's like a designer and an architect, I guess. Similar skill sets, but completely different arenas.
I think I agree with you. I used to call myself a full stack developer, and I did quite a bit around React. But with the book that I was asked to write on Entity Framework Core, just to get into that in that level of detail, you just can't cover the whole plethora of things that you need. Especially, I tend to work now on larger applications, and there's just so much in there that you've got to specialize, or the team has to specialize, because you can't be doing everything. The only downside is I'm glad I've done a lot of front end, because you don't want to, as a back-end person, lose the context for the front end. That's very important, I think.
Definitely. I guess it's the same as when we sit with our clients and we get an idea of what the business needs. We need to get an idea of what business model is. And I think that's kind of similar, I guess, for back-end developers should know the sort of, in quotes, business model of the front end. And I feel like the front-end developers should know like a business model, in quotes, of the back end, that sort of API contract and how this information is going to be stored in the back end or shown on the front end, and the nuances that come with that. I can't give a front end developer an array with 50,000 items and they're all GUIDs and just expect it all to work very well in the front end. Maybe I have to give like a page list, or maybe I have to give them an API endpoint and they can request information as and when they need it.
Yes, there has to be. I work at the architectural level, and you have to have a overview of the whole system, and certainly the business rules or logic or whatever you want to call it, they're spread across the whole back end and the front end, and you've got to understand what the client's trying to achieve, and then work with the other people in the team to achieve that. I think the book, people now ask me to look at things that are on the back end. So that's kind of, and I quite like that. It's big systems with lots of detail. And that's quite interesting. But I can't do the front end at the same time.
Precisely. I always think to myself, if you want to fix the pipes in your house, you get a plumber in. If you want someone to build you a wonderful user interface that is a breeze, a joy to use, that uses whatever technology you want it to use, then you get an expert in. It's the same sort of idea. I know that I could produce a usable interface, but it may not be. Let's say that accessibility is a big issue. I have no idea when it comes to accessibility, so I'll get an accessibility expert to sort of run through what I've built, or maybe an accessibility expert to help me design something, or maybe search engine optimization. Got to go to a search engine optimization expert because I know one or two things, but I don't know, it's a big subject. So I completely agree. I think it's worth knowing of the problems that exist, I think, in the front end. And like I said, if you're a front end dev, maybe knowing that the problems exist in the back end. And I think that having maybe a separate team, one that deals with the front end with some knowledge of the back end, and a team that deals with the back end with some knowledge of the front end, helps maybe from a managerial point of view as well, because then you're not managing, like you said, you don't have one person who knows the entire system back to front, all of the technologies, because then that one person has expert knowledge in all of the different areas, which for one may be more expensive to hire, but for two, what happens if that person doesn't come into work the next day?
Yeah.
Anyway, I think we've veered off topic slightly there. But that's how this show works. I tend to sort of, like I said to you earlier with the pre-recording, we sort of just have an informal chat and just see where it goes.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned the book a few times. So I was wondering, could you talk to us a little bit about the book, what the book's about?
Yes.
Whether it's aimed at back-end developers, front-end developers, whether it's aimed at developers who have, not to give the game away a little bit, but you've mentioned it already, it's about Entity Framework Core. So is it aimed at developers? Is it aimed at DBAs? Is it aimed at someone in between?
Yes. So I was approached by Manning Publications, and they have there was a lot of discussion at the beginning about who this book was for. And at one point, they wanted to make it from starters that didn't really know much and go from there. But, as we talked about the problem and the library, which is a very comprehensive and large library, we decided in the end that we would focus on intermediate to expert. And the book tries to bring you in. The first five chapters are very friendly for people that have never seen anything to do with Entity Framework before. But then as you go in, it does get more complicated, just to try and get the coverage that you need. I think people like to have something which is detailed and deals with the real problems. And what I try to do in the book and what I try to do in any articles I write on my own blog site.
Sure. It totally makes sense. We learn best from examples, regardless of how it is that a person learns. So I think I mentioned to you earlier on that I'm an auditory learner, so I kind of have to hear it to really take it in. I can take some information in via reading, but it tends to not sort of stick around. So even though, let's say I wanted to go learn about Entity Framework, I need an example. I can't just be told, this is what this command does, and this is what this command does, and this is what this command does. It's not going to be as easy to sort of glue it all together to make an application just knowing that there is save changes, or that there is a DB context. Just knowing these things isn't going to help me to build an application. Whereas knowing that I would use a DB context for this thing, or this is how I would use save changes, or this is how I would use this is how I would use that. Knowing that the ideas of how to glue things together kind of helps more than just knowing that they are there. At least when you're starting out, and that's my opinion. That could be completely wrong, because we all have opinions. Yeah,
I think I chose to write a kind of super simple Amazon site selling books, and it's very simple, but it's a real problem. So you can list the books, you can sort them by votes and price and all those sorts of things, and then you can buy a book and etc. And I thought that we're all familiar with an e-commerce site and buying things, so it was easy for people to understand what I was trying to do. And then I in the first 5 chapters I built it up through different stages, and then in later chapters I performance tuned the application, with fed in 100,000 books and sort by everything with 4 stars or more, and that gets challenging. and that seemed to work. And with the book there is a GitHub application, and which has got a branch per chapter, so that you can go to a branch and it will run as the book describes at that point. And then as you go on and you get to the point where I've performance tuned, you can then run it when it's performance tuned. And I think that helped people.
So we've talked a little bit about the book, and we've mentioned Entity Framework Core a few times, and I've mentioned a few of the keywords to do with Entity Framework Core. But before we talk about what Entity Framework Core is, what it aims to sort of solve, those kind of areas, obviously you can use something like ORM, an object relational mapper, which is kind of what Entity Framework is, or you could use ADO.NET and SQL commands and run everything manually and parse everything out using data tables and item arrays and all that kind of stuff. So where does an ORM sit in that sort of hierarchy? Are we talking directly to the database? Are we talking to a thing that talks to the database? How does that all... Is that something that's out of the context of the book?
No. In the book, I write in chapter 1, I have some diagrams of what happens inside Entity Framework when you read things or when you update things. And I'm very visual, so I've got about 100 diagrams in the book, because that's my way of learning, is seeing images. So I started with SQL and ADO.NET, and I've been through various ORMs as they came along. I tend to work in the Microsoft.NET area, so I tried Link SQL, and then I use Entity Framework. The one that runs on the Net framework is called Entity Framework, and then this book was about the new version, Entity Framework Core, which runs on Net Core. So I'd come up through this whole going from SQL to not having to write SQL, and there are some lots of good things about it. So with Entity Framework, if you want to read something from the database, you use the language called LINQ, so Language Integrated Query, which I think most C# developers will be familiar with because it's been around for a while, and you often use it for querying data inside your code. But what Entity Framework does is it captures the expression tree, which is what the link queries, where you write things like where price is less than 10 and, I don't know, published date was before 1999 or something. So it takes that whole link query and it will then turn that into a database access commands to do the query. At the moment, that's SQL databases, a whole range of them, SQL Server, SQLite, I can never say the name.
Is it Postgres?
Postgres, that's it, yeah. And MySQL and all sorts of things. So that's turns it into SQL Server. What is very interesting for me, and I think for most people, is that in version 3 of Entity Framework Core, coming out in September 2019, it will support NoSQL databases as well. The first one will be Cosmos DB, and I think that's a very interesting thing to have, this whole SQL and NoSQL together. And certainly in performance tuning, in chapter 14, I used what's called a CQRS database structure, where I had the writes going to SQL and then the reads came from a NoSQL database. And it will be lovely to be able to do that all inside Entity Framework Core when version 3 comes out.
Wow, there's a lot of information there. That's wonderful. I do like the idea of NoSQL databases. I haven't had a chance to play with any of them at the minute. I've seen lots of wonderful demos with Cosmos DB, I think I saw a demo at, I want to say, MS Ignite or Tech Summit, where they essentially showed the entirety of all of the characters across the entire Marvel universe on one screen, and the person showing it off was just literally click on that and the information is there, click on that, the information is there. It's not click and wait and spin and wait because it's a big SQL query. It was just click, 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 here comes the data. And you mentioned the Entity Framework is the version that runs on .NET, and Entity Framework Core is the version that runs on .NET Core. Could I use Entity Framework with .NET Core, or can I use Entity Framework with .NET Framework, or am I just limited to if I'm writing an application with .NET Framework, do I have to use Entity Framework, or if I'm using .NET Core, or as it will soon be renamed to .NET,
yes,
am I locked to EF Core? Can I sort of mix and match?
You can. I've just done something for a client who had something which was developed under the .NET framework. It's been built over many years, and I added a section of it using Entity Framework Core running on Core because that's faster. But you can mix and match these things because they're trying to do this with Entity Framework Core. You should be able to run either version on either Net Framework or Net Core. My feeling is that the performance tuning that is coming in with Net Core, and some of the performances you're getting out of that is well worth it, which is why when I did for my client, there was a performance issue. So this section of their big application is now running Net Core part inside a Net Standard application, and you can do that. And I did that so that the Entity Framework Core would run as quickly as possible, and we got very good performance out of that.
I like that you can sort of mix and match if you need to, because I know a few developers who are thinking, oh well, Core is specifically for Core and Classic, as it were,
right,
is for framework. But knowing that I can, if I need to, use, maybe I have some legacy Entity Framework stuff, and for some reason something in Entity Framework Core is not supported. I know that even though I'm building something with .NET Core, I can still kind of talk to it. That's useful to know. They're
not doing it with ASP.NET Core. that will only run on Core. I think ASP.NET, the web application, is a more complex thing, and its performance is very important, and they've got fantastic performance on that. So I think they're going to keep that only running on Core. But I'd have to check I don't want to absolutely say, but I believe you can. I've done this thing where you can mix and match, and I believe they're trying to keep Entity Framework Core so that it will run on standard. But don't believe me. Look it up.
Sure. What we'll do is we won't quote you on it, but we'll leave it as an exercise to the listener to go and sort of double check whether they can or not. I think that's a better idea.
Yeah.
And yeah, I do know about the ASP.NET Core as of version 3 will only run on .NET Core.
Yeah.
There was for a short time talk of ASP.NET Core 2.1, I believe, working with Framework, but that was more a case of getting people over the sort of huge jump of, I need to now write all of my applications with Core rather than Framework. There was kind of like a bit of a helping hand, I think.
Yeah.
So we've talked about what EF Core is a little. I guess this one might be a bit of a leading question, but let's say I have Entity Framework Core in one hand, because, I mean, all of programming is using different tools. So we have Entity Framework Core in one hand and ADO.NET or raw SQL readers, that kind of thing, in the other hand. At what point would I want to shift from using one to the other, and I guess vice versa? Is it a case of an argument of, say, C++ versus assembly, or is it two completely different sets of tools for two completely different setups, two different problems, as it were?
I think the reason why people use Entity Framework and any ORM is because, well, there's two reasons. One, you can normally write database accesses quicker. You can develop quicker. It also opens up database accesses to developers who maybe don't know about SQL. So Entity Framework and Entity Framework Core are very complex underneath, but it makes it seem very simple to use on top. You just have classes that are mapped to the database, and you can put these link commands in, and it all magically works. And so that's why I think people use Entity Framework. I can tell you I'm very interested in performance. So I've really drilled down into what you can do with Entity Framework Core. And it's very good, but it's not perfect. And in the book, I try, and then I use Dapper, which is a micro ORM, where you have to write the SQL yourself. So there are places where you can find that Entity Framework may not produce exactly the best SQL in some instances, normally complex instances. And there is a point where if you want to tune it, then you could use SQL directly. And actually, it's very easy to use Entity Framework Core and Dapper together. It's very easy. And that's what I recommend to people is don't be afraid of Entity Framework, but make sure that your database accesses are very clearly defined. And I use something called query objects, but you want them in a very clear place, because you've built this thing and then you find something is too slow. Then you need to get down to it and decide what you do. People use this because it will make them faster at writing database access code, and it's also more amenable to general C# developers who don't really know all the ins and outs of a database.
That makes perfect sense. I think it was Julie Loman who once said that she will do some things with Entity Framework and then maybe show it off to a DBA and say, is this the best way to do it? I'd say maybe 8 times out of 10. I guess it would be. But like you say, there will be those edge cases, those corner cases where because Entity Framework is taking the select statements, the where statements, the filtering, all that kind of stuff, those link queries that you've given it, and it's trying to do its best based on how all of these objects are all mapped together. So it can only do as good a job as you have done, I guess. So yeah, I guess it's useful in that it will make your code faster, in that creating the code will be faster because, like you say, you're not having to write raw SQL. So if I want to do raw SQL or maybe call a stored procedure or something like that, can I do that with Entity Framework, or am I better off using a micro OM to achieve that?
There are commands in Entity Framework Core for doing to allow you to put raw SQL in there. They're fine, but I find Dapper very easy to use. And if I wanted to use raw SQL, I would most likely use Dapper for doing that, because I'm fairly happy with. I'm not an expert, but I've written quite a lot of SQL before, so that's the way I would work with. The other thing, there's a couple of things in EF Core which is very good. They give you a little bit more control over things in some of the SQL. Like you can have a default value for a column, and the big one for me is you can call user-defined functions very easily, and those are like little methods of SQL that you can put in your database. And that I find, if there's just a little bit where it's not quite doing the right thing, rather than just, well, the example I gave in the book was, it's not very good when I want to get all the authors for a book, because there might be multiple authors and I want them as a list to show on the screen. And because it has to go off and get all these multi things, it's not so efficient. But I found on Stack Overflow a nice little bit of SQL that would take the names and put, with commas between them and send them back. So I could turn that into a user-defined function, put it in, and that made things go a lot faster. So it's this mixing and matching. And you do need to be a bit more aware of what's going on in your database. And I think that's the danger. It's another topic I'm kind of segue into. The thing I worry about Entity Framework Core is it hides the database so well that people just start using the classes that are mapped to the database as if it's just any old class that they have anywhere, and going through thousands of them in memories is nothing. But if you want to go through 1,000, they're on your database, it's going to cost you. So I think there is knowing a little bit about what Entity Framework Core is doing underneath, and realizing that you need to think a little bit more about your queries than just doing something that you would have done in your code. That's what I recommend to people. And one of the things that, this is a kind of very specific thing, but it's worth talking about it. In the old version, Entity Framework, last version was the EF6, so I'll refer to it as EF6. If you wrote a link command that it couldn't translate into SQL, it would have an exception, say, I can't do that on the database. And bit of a pain, but it meant you had to think about it and get it right. In EF Core, they wanted to be more friendly. And so they put in something called client versus server evaluation. And so what it will do is it will look at the query that you've created, and it will go, what can I do in the database and what can I do in memory in the client? And it will automatically do that for you. The problem is, if your code is very inefficient, you'll think, oh, Entity Framework is really terrible. It's really bad. And there are ways you could capture it and make sure that it gave you that exception. That was a real worry to me, because it's very easy to write incredibly bad queries. And it's really nice to see in the changes they're making in version 3, they have picked up a lot of little things like that, and they've changed it now. It won't do really bad queries. It will stop you from doing that. And I think that's a very good move, because you as a learning programmer, you might write a link query which is not very efficient and you put it in the wrong place or whatever, and it runs, but it's terrible. And that can be a real problem, because it's very easy to write these things. You run your little unit test with kind of 10 items and it all works fine, and you think, oh, fine, and then it goes to production and it's terrible. So this is the whole thing that why I was in the diagrams and why I was trying to explain what's happening underneath, because a little bit more knowledge will make the queries and the database accesses more performance. And certainly there are some anti-patterns that if you build your whole thing using the wrong pattern, you'll just have overall, it'll all be a bit slow and it will be very hard to get it out. So I give you some guidelines on how to build your queries and how to build your updates, so that you will generally start from a good place. Because I get asked to look at databases and performance and things like that. And there are lots of things where you think that I know what to look for and it's very obvious. And if they hadn't have done it that way, they would be in a better state. They still might need tuning a bit, but the whole application would be faster.
I've seen things out in the wild. I'm reluctant to do this because this is difficult to sort of visualize, but I feel like as you're a visual learner, you'll get it a little more. I have done an episode before where I've talked about entity framework and I've read out some entity relationships and people haven't really gotten it, but I have seen an example before and I've changed the data types to make it fit. But I've seen an example where, let's say you have one university has many colleges, one college has many courses, one course has many tutors, one-to-many tutors, one course has many students, and one student can have many grades. And I've seen code before where it's worked from the bottom up to find all of the average grades for each university based on the colleges and the students. And, it's gone grades upwards to find the best university going up. So obviously you're traversing that entire relationship diagram all the way up to the top, which if you have it in memory, not such a big problem. Obviously that SQL query gets huge and super complex. And, just attacking that problem from the other way around, find me all of the grades for this university, brilliant, store that somewhere, find me all the, rather than go and get me all of the grades throughout the system and then figure out where they are, which university, which course, which tutor, which student, working from the top down, or maybe not even doing that, taking a small slice of the data and working on that and taking another small slice. There was an application that I worked on in the past that did things with date times. And we'll breeze past the fact that the date times weren't stored with an offset or any kind of time zone indication. And it was a multinational company that had asked us to build this thing. But the date times were stored and they were pulled back out, converted to a string for some reason, and then manipulated, converted back to a date time, and then sorted. Yeah, I could totally understand that you can end up writing lots of queries that just are bonkers. I think I'll put it that way, bonkers. And attacking it from a different angle or rethinking it perhaps. Because it's so easy, like you say, to think of it as, because the database is hidden away from you, you don't have to think about that. You just think, I have there's a list of objects, this collection of objects in memory. I'll just interact with them like I would with Link and it will all be fine. But in actual fact, they don't exist on the server at all.
Yep.
Just to explain that a little bit, I guess you can go into more detail, hopefully. But Entity Framework has this idea of a queryable. So you build up a query, and it's when you say to list, or when you say a certain operation, that the query is built as a SQL query, sent down the pipe to the SQL Server or to MySQL or Postgres, whatever, and then brought back. And it's during that bringing back process that all of the objects are then brought into memory. So knowing that is a thing, I guess, really helps.
Yeah.
To really help you come up with better queries. Because, like you say, if you think of it all as just all of my records are in memory, then yeah, you're going to have a bad time, I guess.
Yeah, what I would recommend, if you go to the Manning site, in chapter 1, it's free. You could that's a free chapter, and it has some diagrams in there that just lays out what's happening inside Entity Framework Core when it's going through things. And I hope that is useful to people. It just gives you an idea of what's going on underneath, and that makes you more aware of what's happening and what you should be careful about. Can I say one thing as well? One thing that, if you've never come across SQL before and you're a bit worried about it, then in Entity Framework 6, EF6, the old one, it is the older one, when it output its SQL, which you could capture, it was efficient, but it was very, very hard to understand. It was written all in kind of like a computer wrote it. It was just horrible. And it was really hard to understand. EF6, they actually output SQL in a format that is almost like someone would write, even with the indents in it. And they're beautiful to look at. So I often, in my unit tests, I capture the SQL that's coming out and have a look at it and go, oh, that's interesting. And you start to learn what it's doing. And also you're learning, if you don't know SQL, that's a good way to learn what's happening underneath it, what it's producing. And I really recommend that. I have a library which helps people when they're unit testing with Entity Framework Core. It's an open source library. It's on my GitHub page. You can find it on there. And I describe it in the book, but there's full information. And in that, you can capture the logging, which contains the SQL, and just put it out to your screen. And so you can run your little test and see what SQL it produces. And I find that very helpful.
I like that, because then, like you say, if you don't know SQL, or maybe you just want to level up your SQL knowledge, you can write a query, fire it off to Entity Framework Core, and see what it's doing to your series of link statements. Your link statements, link to objects, link to SQL, whatever, you can see how it's converting that, and then go, yes, like you said, yes, that's how I would do enumerating, this is how I would write a where clause, or this is how I tell the database to give me all of the properties for this table or something. I'll have to get a link and put that in the show notes. That sounds like it's something that at the very least I'd be interested in, and I should give that a go myself. I'm competent with SQL, but I feel like I'm at the level where I'm competent enough to be dangerous.
Yes. So if you download the project called EF Core in Action, and you run something like branch chapter 5, if you run that, it gives you this very simple, there's only 50 books in it, but it will build it all for you and put it on your screen using SQL Server. And it gives you can click something at the top called logs, and it will show you the SQL that was produced. And then you can try saying, okay, I want to sort by price. Okay, what does that do? And then I want to filter by 4 stars or better. And you can see how the SQL changes. And then I go in chapter 13, I performance tune the thing through 3 stages. And again, you can look at the logs and see what's happening. And it's very helpful.
So what about changes to the database then? So I know from personal experience that when when a database changes, because they all do, it's not a problem. When your database model changes and the client says you need to capture these things as well as these things, and we need to map them together and somehow do some magic and display it all on screen. So that's a change to the database. Obviously, in the past, we've had to then manually script, right, add that table, add this column, this foreign key over here, add this primary key over there, add some constraints, that kind of thing. Is this something that Entity Framework Core can help with? Because obviously, a lot of folks who haven't used Entity Framework are thinking, well, I don't have a database, and I'm going to build it up as I go along. Can I change the database? Can I alter the structure of the database with Entity Framework Core?
Yes, you can. Let me tell you what Entity Framework Core has. It's similar to what EF6 had, but a little bit better. The first thing to say, if you have an existing database, there's a thing called reverse engineering or scaffolding, which will read your database and build you all the classes and all the setup that you need to access that database. So that's quite useful. And I've used that with my clients. But if you are starting with Entity Framework Core and it's a new project, then you can use something called migrations. So what happens is, say you build your first thing. So by chapter 3, you could put up books and list them and all that sort of stuff, but you couldn't buy them. And then in chapter 4, I added business logic to allow you to buy a book. And so I had to add an order and a line item table to the database. And what happens is you add the classes that you represent that, and then you can say to it, add a migration. It goes and it looks at all what was there at the beginning and what you've added. And it goes, oh, there's 2 new classes that go to these. And it will then build the commands to take your database from chapter 3, where there were no order and line items, and it will add the order and line items to it. And so that's a really good thing, but I'm going to put a big but here. Database migrations like that are great, especially for small systems and things that you're just trying out. But when it comes to production systems, I don't use that. I use another method, and I will send you the link to it. But I've written 2 very long articles about how you can create a migration and then how you can apply a migration to a database. And if you've got a production database and you have to update it, it's a scary thing, right? If you've really got an e-commerce site and you've got, even if you want to take it down and stop it while you do the update, you don't want to mess anything up. If you want to update it while people are still using it, it's even more hard. So I found that database migrations take me so far, but I do it by building my own SQL scripts that update the database. And I have a tool which can tell me whether my scripts will create a database that matches the classes that I've changed in the software. So, and that's really important, because if you try and manually update it, you might not quite get it the way that Entity Framework thinks it should look. And so, that's what I use. And again, this thing about the SQL it produces is very nice. So I often get it to, in a unit test, I'll say, okay, create me the database with everything in, and then I'll look at what it does and copy out the bits that I need to put in my migration. So I go through all of that in the book, but I also on my site I've got 2 very long, detailed articles that covers this whole thing.
What I'll have to do is I'll have to get some links to those and put those in the show notes. And I'll have to go read those myself. I'm always interested to find out how something is actually working underneath the covers. Because, like you say, it's okay knowing that Entity Framework exists, but, getting an understanding of, even just a basic understanding of, here's what Entity Framework does for you and here's how it does it, kind of helps you to understand maybe there's a better way to write the query that you're thinking about, or maybe you're going about it in a less optimal way, or maybe you are doing it the best way, and maybe Entity Framework just doesn't really support what you're trying to do.
Yes. People do use migration in real applications, the Entity Framework migrations. I just want people to stop and think about what they're doing when they update a production database, because you really don't want to get that wrong.
Most definitely. I can remember a time when, for one project I was working on, I was asked by the client it's okay, just go into the database and change this value. And I don't even have to tell you the rest of the story for you to know. This was very early on in my career, and at a point where I didn't really like to say no. And at the time, like I say, very early on in my career, I wasn't aware of transactions being a thing.
Yeah, I got in contact with the Microsoft development team way back in EF6 because I wrote a long article saying I had an e-commerce site that I was working on, and I just said, I just can't trust the migration system that's built into Entity Framework, and this is what I've done. And there was some stuff backwards and forward. They were very interested, they wanted to hear why and understand what I was talking about. And they have been more careful in Entity Framework Core. In EF6, by default, if you didn't tell it not to, it would try and migrate any database when it started. And that was by default. In EF Core, it's not by default. You have to trigger it, and they give you very clear guidelines on what to do, especially when you're running a web application which has got multiple instances running. You've got to be careful.
I remember when I think I was reading an interview with, I want to say it was Julie Loman again. I'm not sure. I'm a bit hazy as to exactly who'd said it, but essentially they let EF at the time, but it's now EF Core, obviously, let EF come up with a migration, and then we'll go to an actual DBA and say, here's my entity relationships, here's what I want, and here's what I've given it. What should it have done?
Yeah.
But I guess, if you don't have a DBA on the team, the thing that the migrations, I guess, that EF creates are good enough.
Yes, and early on, if you're, some of these things take a while, don't they? So you might want to use migrations at the beginning. That's fine. It's just when you get to the production, you've got to think, do I trust this to do this in the right way? And in most cases it will. And the Microsoft recommendation is you get the migration, and there's a command where you can turn it into a script, a SQL script, which you then apply to the database using some tool that is appropriate for your database. So that's the recommended way of doing it. And then you can check things and go, oh, yeah, I didn't really mean that. Because sometimes I look at the SQL for the migration that EF Core would go, and I go, oh, I forgot that. I didn't set that one as not nullable. And that's my mistake. But by looking at the SQL, and I knew that this string should be not null, and it shows a fault in my code because I'd forgotten to mark it with a required attribute on the property.
I've always felt that it can lead to those kind of constraints. You recognize where those constraints should be versus what is detected. So obviously when you add a new column, so one of the things that migrations will do is, unless you say so, when a new column is added, it will be marked as nullable because obviously the previous records won't have a value. But you can then say to it, right, okay, I want it to be non-nullable, and I want you to go do some extra logic with the records that already exist. Maybe put a default value in there or something.
Yep.
Okay, well, that's mainly the questions that I have for today. I know that I'm going to be going away, scratching my head and rethinking about EF Core, if I'm honest, because it's something that I've, in my recent projects, I've had the opportunity to walk away from using an ORM and try sort of SQL hard mode, using SQL connections and calling stored procedures directly from .NET. And I think it's given me the opportunity to sort of see it from the other side and understand how it's all actually glued together from a 10,000 foot view anyway. I'm looking forward to looking back into EF Core, because the majority of the stuff that I've done with EF Core in the past has been, here's a little silly demo app or a web API that I've built just for some kind of talk or a demo just to show something off. But I'm looking forward to getting back into it.
Yeah. One of the clients I work for, they had 300 databases, and they were using sharding and multi-tenant. And I built a system using Entity Framework Core and ASP.NET Core, obviously, with a web API out to an Angular front end. And that was all using Entity Framework Core. We did some performance tests, but we didn't have enough data at that stage while I was involved. But my experience is that in a web application, you get tons and tons of admin commands or things that need to be done that are not very important. And then you get maybe, I don't know, it depends on the application, but it could be between 20 or 20%, or it could be just 5% of the queries or the updates that really matter. And you want to spend your time on that. So by building with Entity Framework Core, you're going to build it quickly. If you build it well, such that all your queries are nicely isolated, when you have a problem, you can go and go to that isolated part and then tune that up. But you've saved all the time on all these boring, I've built applications. There's so much boring admin stuff, isn't there? That some of them it's used very rarely, and you just want to get it done.
Yeah.
So that you can then focus on the few things that really matter. And if you have to rewrite all that bit in SQL, or do something clever with Redis and caches and all that sort of stuff, that's fine. That's part of the job. But you don't want to be always working with SQL across the whole thing and have really fast admin commands that were going to be fast anyway. So that's my approach anyway.
And yeah, you're right. Entity Framework, Entity Framework Classic, I guess, and Core both allow you to really just sort of speed through again, not to reduce what DBAs do, but the sort of the crud of getting everything up and running. Because I think I've said it before that there's a quote somewhere in the Phoenix project and a book called The Goal, which essentially says that until the product is in the customer's hands, so the customers of your client, until the product is in their hands, it's making no money for anyone. Except for you, I suppose. And we need to get that. That's why we have things like Agile and DevOps and things like that, to try and get the working software out as quickly as possible, get as much feedback as quickly as possible, and this way you don't have to sit and write the sort of boilerplate. Okay, so I'm going to do a SQL command. Okay, so I'm going to do using SQL command equals new command. Oh wait, I've got to do a connection first, so open a connection, then generate a command, put all the parameters in, fill a data set coming back out. Now I've got a data set. Now I've got to go dataset.datatables. Do they exist? Is it not null? Do I have the right amount? Okay, now give me the rows. Right now, for each through the rows. Brilliant. Now I've got to convert, because it comes back as an object. Yeah. I've got to toString it and then pull it out as an int, and then pull it out as a bool. And that's just for one row.
Yeah.
Maybe that one row represents a single object. You got to then populate the rest of the objects. So yeah, I think you're right. It really does help with sort of getting you up to speed and started very quickly.
Yeah, let me also tell you about one feature that you may not realize it's there, but if you had, let's take our order with our line items. So you have an order and you have a one-to-many line items. So you bought this book at this price and you bought this book at that price. Okay. When you do that in SQL, you have to write one out to get the primary key to fill in the foreign key in the line item. So you write the order out, you get that, and then you can fill in the line items. Yes?
Yes.
So this is the typical thing that you're doing. So if you have complex sets of things, you have to put them all out in the right order and then move the keys and foreign keys around. Entity Framework has something called navigational properties. So I have an order with a collection of line items. And if I just fill all those in using those navigational properties, when I save it, Entity Framework goes, oh, I need to save that and then copy that over. And it does all the foreign keys and primary key setups for you. And in that particular thing, the order with the line items, that's fairly easy. But you have something big, and I had a client who already uses EF Core, and he says, oh, we've got to write them out in the right order to get the primary keys and the foreign keys right. I said, no, Entity Framework does that all. You just build up all these things linked together, and Entity Framework will carefully go through it and find out, oh, that one was you read from the database, this one you updated, this one you created a new one, and it'll look at it all, sort it all out, and push it out to the database in one transaction and do it right. That is such a saving of time. Such a saving of time, of development time.
It really is, yeah. Well, that's all the questions and topics I think we should really cover in this episode anyway. I mean, I've kept you around for over an hour at this point, and I realise, we're in the evening, it's time for you to go and do some chill out stuff, whatever it is that you do in your evening. So I just want to say thank you ever so much, Jon, for taking the time to talk to me today about Entity Framework and just how magically wonderful it is.
I am a fan, so thank you for giving me the opportunity to spread some good news.
Thank you very much, Jon. And I really do enjoy talking about these kinds of technologies with people, just to partially to broaden my own knowledge, but also to give an expert like yourself the chance to say, this is really cool, and here is why.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you ever so much. That was my interview with Jon Smith about Entity Framework Core. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff we covered, and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice, and to come back next time for some more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks. The .NET Core podcast is a production of RJJ Software Limited.